French and German foreign ministers issue simultaneous statements against the United States. 2 months after the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act was enacted, European leaders are finally realizing how serious the situation is. The Biden administration, through the bill, has heavily subsidized the local electric vehicle industry with a purchase tax, allowing the originally not strong enough U.S. trolley companies to rise overnight and squeeze out almost all foreign brands. This not only makes the entire supply chain in the 20% of the European companies lost a lot of market, and the U.S. side of the subsidy for all in the local manufacturing of batteries and production companies, coupled with low-cost energy. Many European companies have planned to move production lines to the United States. The future of this trend will become increasingly serious. When Macron and Scholz met late last month, they first mentioned the topic of fighting back against unfair competition from the United States. Macron warned that if things continue, they will have to create opportunities for their own European manufacturers, which is inevitable, and Scholz agreed with Macron that the EU needs to counter the US on this issue. Their plan can be broadly summarized in 2 ways. One is to send representatives to Washington to deal with Biden to ask them to cancel the terms or reduce subsidies, and the other is to give local car companies corresponding subsidies to attract them to stay in Europe. Late on the 24th, Germany and France finally decided to join forces against the U.S. policy. French Economy and Finance Minister Le Maire and German Economy Minister Habeck issued a statement saying that the consequences of the American bill are unimaginable and that it is irresponsible for the U.S. side to risk triggering a transatlantic trade war by introducing the bill. For this reason, they will fight back strongly and discuss the introduction of a Buy European Act that also gives subsidies to European companies. This means that Germany and France will focus on the same issues that they already do. This means that Germany and France have put the focus on subsidies to local enterprises, trying to use this method to confront the U.S. subsidy policy. The 2 sides began to choke. This year, it can be said that the United States has offended all these friends in Europe. As the weather turned colder, more and more Europeans took to the streets to launch protests. The theme of the protest is much the same: want to achieve the purpose, is to regain access to cheap energy from Russia. The atmosphere in Germany was the most heated, with anti-war rallies in dozens of German towns and cities, where people were generally anti-American and pro-Russian, accusing some German politicians of acting as puppets for the U.S. and serving the interests of the U.S. and NATO. Others said Ukraine is a haven for warmongers and arms dealers. In contrast to the criticism of the West and Ukraine, the protesters were very tolerant of Russia, calling for peaceful coexistence with Russia and expressing their dissatisfaction with the West's resistance to Russia and anti-Russia. Some Germans were very insightful, with some calling the Russia-Ukraine conflict Biden's war. Some complained that ordinary Germans were paying for the U.S. crackdown on Russia. During this period, there was also a very confusing scene in which the far left and the far right protested together on both sides of the tracks on a tram in Leipzig, speaking out in favor of Russia. According to the Western way of dividing the left and right wings, the far right generally leans more towards Russia and the far left more towards anti-Russia when it comes to Ukraine. The fact that the far left and far right are now one family shows that it is indeed very difficult for Europeans. The Western mainstream media is reporting these protests by claiming that Europeans are marching against the war, trying to highlight that the people are only against the war, not against European policies and Ukraine. But in reality, what the protesters are really highlighting is that they are against the West and against the United States. They are not concerned about the war, but about the chain reaction it has started. It was Europe's initiative to go for sanctions against Russia that led to the gradual disappearance of all types of cheap Russian energy from the European market, replaced by energy bought from the United States at 4 times the high market price. the general public was more concerned about the war than watching it. So at the beginning, Europeans were generally concerned about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and under the propaganda of the Western public opinion machine, they stood for Europe and the United States and opposed Russia. However, when the energy crisis intensified, Europeans stopped paying attention to the Russian-Ukrainian battlefield because their lives were directly affected. Now, Europeans are getting more and more discontent because the weather is gradually getting colder. Snow has started to fall in Europe, and as the temperature gradually drops, Europeans are becoming more and more awake as they face major challenges to their survival. It is not uncommon for people to freeze to death in the winter in Europe and the United States. This winter, which is expected to be affected by La Niña, will still be a colder winter than normal, which, combined with soaring energy prices and insufficient energy supplies, is likely to cause a significant portion of the population to fail to carry the winter. When the Russian-Ukrainian conflict did not affect their lives, are not concerned about the attitude, now the Russian-Ukrainian conflict affects the lives of Europeans and even survival, the mentality of Europeans have changed, began to take to the streets, shouting for their own interests. Facts show that freezing a freeze still has an effect, the cold tends to make people's heads clearer, and normal intelligence reoccupies the high ground. The European media predicted that similar protests would intensify as the temperature dropped further. European countries are planning for this by stepping up police training to deal with the possibility of mass protests. But whether they can withstand the pressure, it is estimated that European politicians do not have a spectrum in mind. Because a single country to withstand the pressure is not enough, once a country's revolution is successful, it will trigger a chain reaction, resulting in a revolution sweeping the European continent. As a major auto producer, German Chancellor Scholz warned that the U.S. approach could lead to a serious tariff war. At the same time, in order to make more European companies stay, French President Macron also hosted 49 executives of major European companies at the Élysée Palace to convince them to stay in Europe. The European Commission has also said that the U.S. bill is contrary to the provisions of the WTO. The EU will take measures to retaliate. If the U.S. does not make changes, the EU will have to go to the WTO to discuss. By the impact of soaring energy prices, some energy-intensive industries in Europe had to cut back on production capacity to save money, and even some enterprises directly shut down. As the U.S. energy prices are much lower than in Europe, so many European companies choose to relocate the industrial line to the United States. According to data released by the German media, due to low energy costs and policy attraction, there have been more than 60 German companies to invest in the United States to build factories, like Siemens, Lufthansa and other large enterprises are included. Volkswagen Group also built a new battery factory in the United States in Tennessee, is expected to be able to invest $7.1 billion in the place in about 5 years. There are also European companies like Mercedes-Benz and BMW that have also run to the U.S. for investment. After Europe fell into an energy dilemma due to sanctions against Russia, Macron has complained more than once about the doubling of U.S. natural gas for sale, and now a bill has been introduced to attract European companies, and France is even more dissatisfied. According to British media reports, if more companies go to the United States to set up factories to invest, may lead to a direct loss of €8 billion in the French market. For the U.S. approach, France has a long experience. Last year, the U.S. and Britain joined forces to steal the $66 billion worth of nuclear submarines signed by France and Australia. After that, Biden also specifically called Macron, said his approach is clumsy, so that the two sides to ease relations. But this time, the US approach, which may change the pattern of industrialization in Europe, and even hollow out the European industrial system, is not so easy to set things right.